Thanks for joining us inside the Dancer's Studio, where we bring listeners like you closer to the creative process. Inside the Dancer's Studio is a program of the National Center for Choreography at the University of Akron as part of our Ideas in Motion initiative. This episode was recorded in the presence of a live audience in March of 2022. Today, we join Christy Bolingbroke, our Executive Artistic Director, in conversation with Minneapolis-St. Paul performer and choreographer Ashwini Ramaswamy, who trained and performs in the lineage of Bharatanatyam. As a founding member of Ragamala Dance Company, she has toured extensively through the U.S. and in Russia, Taiwan, Indonesia, Japan, the UK, and India, as well as performed in well-known U.S. venues like Lincoln Center Out of Doors and the Kennedy Center. Her own choreographic work has been presented by venues including the Joyce Theater and the Yard and has found support through the National Dance Project and U.S. Artists International. The New York Times described Ashwini as weaving together both fearfully and joyfully the human and the divine.
How or where did you know that you wanted to be a choreographer?
So dance for me was a natural part of growing up. My mother, Rani Ramaswamy, and my sister, Aparna Ramaswamy, are my dance teachers. Rani founded Ragamala Dance Company, where I'm now a choreographic associate and communications director, in 1992. And Aparna, my older sister, became co-artistic director with her in 2000. And so they've been doing this for a really long time. And it was a path that they've been on since the 80s, since I was basically born. So since I, as I like to say, was a sentient being, there was dance and music and creation happening in my house. So there was always the possibility of dance that was an open path to me.
The
for
family
my whole life.
business.
Exactly, it's the family business. And a way for me to connect to being Indian because I was born in this country. And I had a hard time naturally adapting to that because I rebelled against what was expected of me because, someone's always telling you have to do something or everyone around you is doing something. You don't necessarily want to do that. So for me, I danced literally as an after-school job. I was in a dance company as my job. And because it was fun and was able to go to India because of that and spend time with my family. And so that was what I did as a hobby and through college.
Thanks for joining us inside
because
the Dancer's
in my mind
Studio,
it was never a choice, it was an expectation and I wanted to make a choice.
Process.
And then
Inside
after
the
college I moved to New York City and became a book publicist. I was an English literature major and always very interested in reading and books. And I learned the skills that then I now translate into communications for the company. And over those 4 years, I talked on the phone with Ronnie and Aparna every day because the cell phone was a new thing. I'm dating myself. The cell phone was newish.
You're dating all of us.
Yes. The cell phone was newish, and we would talk all the time. And at that time, this was 2003, 2004, Ragamala was touring more and more, and I was seeing the actual impact that they were having on communities in terms of making inroads for Indian classical dance within the contemporary landscape.
Thanks for joining us inside the
really
Dancer's
making a
Studio,
difference. And I thought that
bring listeners like you
in my
closer to
in
the
my youth
creative
growing
process.
up, I always thought it would just be
Inside
something
the
that
Dancer's
stayed in
Studio
Minnesota
is a
and stayed in
program
our
of the
community.
National Center for
But they were
Choreography at the
actually
University of
making
Akron
a
as
national
part of our
success
Ideas in
story
Motion
out of
initiative.
the family business.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was something that I could contribute to, and it would be
next one
my
will
only
be
chance. I was in my
ITDS.
20s, and I thought if I was going to do professional dance, this was the time. And so I went back to Minneapolis in 2007 and then spent about 10 years retraining because it's such a specific form with so many different facets, and I had been away for 5 years. So I spent a lot of time working on my craft. And then deciding that I had a personal vision as well, just as they did. And if I was going to make dances, they would look different. They would have an aesthetic connection for sure. But what would my stories be? And so that's kind of how I was led into choreography.
I love that idea of how there's always a question, I think, with any artistic talent and practice, how much is nature versus nurture, and growing up inside of that environment, being in the family business, but the aha moment that, wait, it's actually bigger than your family. And that is an exciting opportunity when you talk about choice to re-engage and participate.
Exactly.
Let's talk more about your story. So where does inspiration strike? I think this is something that could speak to either anyone writing a book, having to paint a painting or make a dance. There is that ominous blank page.
Yes. I'll say the cliche thing first, which is the write what you know, what they say about to writers. It's two things for me. It's a personal experience, absolutely, and what would I want to see on stage? Those two things coming together. My first full-length piece is a show called Nocturne, which I created in 2016. And the inspiration for that was my grandfather. He was alive at the time. This was in 2013, 14. He was explaining to he was an entomologist. He was a well-known entomologist in India, and he moved in with my mother.
Entomology is
the study of insects.
Okay.
And I remember being a kid and going to, I'm not afraid of insects because of him. I really think they're amazing. And we would go to his department and he would just have drawers and drawers of amazing looking bugs. And he would study them all the time. I found it fascinating. And he was telling my nephews a story about a specific insect that was nocturnal and that I don't remember exactly what it did or is called now, but it had its role in the universe was microscopic, but also a huge. It ended up being like a big part of everyday life. So I started thinking about night and the things that happen at night that we don't see and how much of an impact they might make in the world that we don't even know that's happening. And then thinking about that as an allegory for people who are unseen and people who are making differences that we don't know about or think about. That was kind of the idea.
That aren't always in the light, but perhaps doing the work.
Exactly.
I think about other allegories like, the shoemaker's elves that help them with different things. Yes. Or as you were talking about bugs, I thought about bees, and that seems very topical right now too.
Exactly. And we don't think about those things. And then of course the eternal connection between nature and man and how we separate ourselves from nature when we should be more a part of it. So these themes that were coming together based on my grandfather's occupation became the first show. And I think it was like I couldn't get it out of my head, and so I had to make it.
Yes. So as the process unfolds, how would you describe your relationship to sound?
Well, that's a great question because in Bharatanatyam is meant to be danced to a very specific geographical kind of music because the dance and the music, they say, we don't know what came first. It's that connected.
Yes.
And same with sculpture in this form. So when you see temple sculptures of dancers, they say, did the dance come from the sculpture or did the sculpture come from the dance? It's very multidisciplinary at its core. So breaking away from traditional classical music is a big deal because it's supposed to be so connected to the movement. So Ragamala has been doing this for many, many years, and we do believe that it can be done if done in a very methodical and a way that has intention, and maybe the roots have connections, or maybe there's the thematic nature has connections, or you create the dance anew so that it fits that music.
As a baseline, does Ragamala always work with the same musicians? Or I think every time I've seen Ragamala perform, it has been with live musicians. The goal is to always have live music. As you saw in our last production, we did not have live music because we had a set that was very intricate and there wasn't space for them on the stage for that because they always sit to the left. Audience left.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Performer right. And there is a I don't want to say it's not freedom, but there's something about dancing to the classical Carnatic music that feels the most satisfying. It's supposed to be that way. But when you can find that in other forms. So for Ragamala, yes, it's almost always live music, not always Carnatic music only, but usually there is a Carnatic music component. So there'll be a hybrid orchestra or it'll be just Carnatic. That's in the last 10 years, that's been mainly the focus. So we get that connection to what we feel is the correct music, what feels good to us to dance to, because that's so important.
Yeah.
So the relationship to sound it's this intrinsic thing, if the music doesn't move you or doesn't work for you, then it's just not going to feel right on stage. So I'm all about experimentation with intention and with this idea that somewhere along the line there's a connection that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I am curious as we get into honing into more how you're shaping your own creative practice and choreographic voice. The first thing we worked on together in fall of 2019, you were working, I think, really in an interesting way. Can you talk about that experimentation with music? Because there was a DJ, but you also had a composer, and you had, I don't know if they were technically Carnatic singers, but more traditional Indian musicians. So talk a little bit about, how did you get there? What did you learn from that?
Yes, so the piece you're referring to is called Let the Crows Come, and I was in residence here, technical residence, in, as you said, 2019. The seed of the idea for that piece came from a DJ. I think I saw a performance where someone used the DJ, and because I saw dance and music at the same time, I think that's where the connection came, where I said, when a DJ takes a song that we all know and then remixes the song and makes a new song, I kind of feel like that as a person. Yeah. Because I'm Indian, but when I was in elementary school in suburban Minneapolis, I wanted to be really American, and so I would remix myself to fit into that place. And so it felt like a very natural, not allegory again, but just a way to show that in music.
I specialize in dance, but I think the musical term is sampling. Right. When you hear that recognizable dun 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 dun, and you're like, which song is this going to be? Right, depending on when you grew up and when you heard it. So
exactly. So it takes you back to a certain place and a time, but then it's now in the present. So you get this idea of being culturally and culturally remixed is, I guess, what I would say. And I wanted that DJ to also be a composer. And so I was having an informational meeting with Kate Nordstrom, who curates a series at the time called Liquid Music. And she said, I have the perfect person. He lives in New York. His name is Joyce Clayton. He's an author, and he does research on technology, basically, on how technology changes cultures. And he's a composer and he's a DJ. So it's like this perfect mix, because I feel like our dance form is also grappling with how to take historical forms and traditional forms and kind of map their trajectory into the present.
Remix with intention.
Exactly. So that's where it started. And in the original iteration of the piece, it was going to be he was going to be one composer, and then we have a composer we always work with in India. And there was going to be the two of them, and me and the two other dancers I selected, we were going to have a soundscape developed by both. But as we kept meeting, Jason and I realized what the structure of the piece would be to show the audience Bharatanatyam in its classical form, music included, and then have two extrapolations of the same piece on two different dancers. And he said, well, maybe you should have a third composer so that each dancer has its own soundscape, which made sense to me, which is when the third composer, who's an electroacoustic cellist, so he does looping techniques. His name is Brent Arnold. And so that's how the structure of the piece started developing. I created a solo with the Carnatic composer, and we had 3 Carnatic musicians, a vocalist, a violinist, and a mridangist, percussionist. And they worked with me to create that song, and I used poetry from India and made that solo. And then I worked with a dancer called Barrett Algren, who does Gaga, a form from Israel, contemporary form. And we took sections of my solo, I videotaped it, I reversed it and slowed it down, and I would send her the clips, and then she would come into the studio and show me the reverse of what I did, because that's a Gaga technique practice. They do reverse movement. And then the third dancer, his name is Alana Morris, and she went to Juilliard, and she's a modern trained, but she's also from Trinidad, and so she's interested in African diasporic dance forms.
Yes.
And she's very full-bodied and very emotional as a dancer. So we use the narrative framework as well as the gestural language of Bharatanatyam to extrapolate the gestures into full-bodied movement for her. And then over the course of about a year, because they live in Minneapolis too, we got together and created their solos. So when you see the whole piece unfold, it's a reprocessing of the original solo and giving people the opportunity to make connections about Bharatanatyam through different bodies and different forms that they wouldn't otherwise potentially see.
Yeah. I feel that you've somewhat been foreshadowing the answer to this next question, but I'll ask it as part of our practice. So how would you define 21st century dance practices? This has been something that we've been doing with the students and with the faculty here, and then also with each of our visiting artists. And I'd love to give you this space to name it in your own terms.
I have many things running through my head as I think about this, because so much of our work, my family's work, is to convey the idea that anything that you're making now is a contemporary piece of art. So I might be using a vocabulary handed down to me, but when I put it together in my own way, it's a new dance. It's a new piece of work.
Yes.
And so people have a really hard time not understanding that the dances themselves are not passed on from person to person. And we like to equate it to just learning a language. If you are in kindergarten and you're learning to write your alphabet, it doesn't mean that you have to write the Bible. You can write...
That's the only thing that language was for.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. You don't have to write you won't write a hundreds of year old book. You will write a new novel or if it's nonfiction, it's still new. And so that is, I think, an easier way for people to understand it. What's happened in the 21st century, which I think is very interesting, is when we were learning, especially when my mom and sister were learning, but when I was also learning growing up, we had no mirrors and we wrote everything down. And so all the corrections, we have notebooks and notebooks and notebooks full of meticulous corrections from class, hours of class. And there's no video, there's no reliance on any sort of technology to remember all of that. Once you write it down, you almost don't even need to refer to the book again. I still do that. I have a book in my backpack that I take notes from class, and then I just remember it next time.
Kinesthetic learning in that way. That speaks, I think, regardless of dance training. You're like, oh, I did it through my hand. I'm more likely to remember it.
Exactly. And when you learn without a mirror and you feel what the corrections are, it's very different than relying on a reflection. And I think of the video as the same thing. Of course, now I do use video all the time because it's so much easier to remember and have, especially when I'm working with other forms and I can't do them myself. But there is something about that method of learning that feels more like it really sits in you, less surface almost. I'm not saying it's better, but it's just the 21st century has connected us in such a way that we can use all these devices and it's a great thing, but I think sometimes it's easier to forget things or kind of not embody them in the same way as when you're just being told and you have to remember them in your mind.
There a couple things come back for that. I mean, first of all, you acknowledged it in your collaboration with Joyce and how he experiments with technology. That also, I totally agree, feels very 21st century. But it is the historical knowledge of the past. And how do you make space for that? How do you honor that? But then where do you also include your thoughts on it? If someone were to be asked to write a paper about Shakespeare or Victorian literature, it isn't just putting them in a time capsule, but rather to interpret and build off of it and keep the conversation going. And so I love that idea also in dance, and hopefully more culturally rooted choreographers will think about that, because I know they're having those conversations. Patrick Mkuakane, who was here a couple of weeks ago with Christopher K. Morgan, an artist, I remember him speaking on a panel and saying, like, what if in a culturally rooted or traditional form, the one aesthetic is, I might be paraphrasing here, experimentation, is change. That's what he meant. Like, what if change is the one constant? I think both as an artist and in life, that really spoke hugely to me.
Well, it's interesting because for us, a change could be so subtle that you wouldn't know, but it might feel radical for a form that's so subtle and so intricate. Yesterday, I talked to somebody at the Groundworks company where I was working for the day about, they asked, why don't you want to change the grammar that you've learned? What is wrong with taking a step and then changing its movement fully? Which,
like a noun and making it a verb?
I will do that for somebody else. I won't do that for myself because Bharatanatyam is an oral tradition. It always is changing because it's taught to us orally, and the practitioner will embody that in a different way. But it's also taken so many years to create the aesthetic framework. So much work has gone into, your hands need to be 2 inches in front of your chest and this high because this is where it looks best. And there's nothing wrong with experimenting with that, but if the work has been done for you, you enjoy how that looks, then working within that is actually freeing.
I think that also could be really great advice for any of our dancers who have trained for years and years in ballet and are trying to find their own voice. With that in mind, I'll ask our last question, which is, what advice would you like to impart to our students? This could be the best piece of advice or something meaningful that you received and you'd like to pass it on, or you can make up advice of your own if you have some to share.
I think, so first of all, saying this as someone who is privileged enough to grow up in this family that laid a lot of the groundwork and the pathways ahead of me. But if you're interested in just being a dancer, if you're interested in being a dance artist, not a generative dance artist, working as a dancer, not as a choreographer, then I think realizing that you need to put in so much time, not just running things, but thinking about what's the intention behind this movement and how can you really make it the most effective movement that it can be. So when you're in the studio, it's easy to just do a practice that keeps your stamina up. But what is going to make you stand out is that attention to the intention.
It is not just the physical, but it sounds like the mental and the emotional too.
Yes, exactly. As a choreographer, I would say, don't make work that you think other people want to see you make.
Nice.
Because as I was telling you, my two categories for myself are something that's personal and something I want to see. Make what you want to see on stage, and make what you have to make. And that those are the works that will be changed, that will be effective, I think, and work for you. And the third thing I will say is have informational meetings. Every single opportunity I believe that has come my way has been because I reach out to people without asking for something. I mean, advice. Sure. But in my mind, I don't have an end game to that. And I'm always like, oh, really? Later on, you want the piece, or it's always been very unexpected and organic. That's not to say that you shouldn't apply for things and have a lot of drive, but people want to give you advice, and a lot of times when you are telling them your ideas, they're seeing it from a perspective that is, it's not about selling something. It's about really telling them what you want to do. That's very compelling.
And getting to know people as people, not just the positions they hold.
Exactly. And that really gives you a deeper understanding of the whole industry. And it's not just people. Hopefully you're not seeing people as just gatekeepers.
Yeah.
They're people who want to help you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ashwini. Please join me in thanking her.
Thank you.
Inside the Dancers Studio Lunchtime Talk Series is supported by NCCAkron, the University of Akron, the University of Akron Foundation, and the Mary Schiller Myers Lecture Series in the Arts. Our podcast program is produced by Jennifer Edwards. Ellis Roven is our composer and editor. Theme music by Flaco Torres. Cover art by Micah Krause. Special thanks to Kat Wentz and the team on the ground in Akron, Ohio. To learn more about NCCAkron, please visit us online at nccakron.org and follow us on Instagram or Facebook at NCCAkron. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we encourage you to subscribe on your favorite podcast streaming platform by searching for Inside the Dancers Studio. Please share with your friends, and if you'd like to help get the word out, rate us and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening, and stay curious.